Ling Chi, usually translated to death by 1,000 cuts, was a form of execution in China dating back to the 10th century, and aside from how grim this was, it also held a much deeper meaning. If you were sentenced to die this way, it meant you'd messed up in the worst way. Ling Chi was reserved for crimes like treason, matricide, and patricide, or mass killing. The condemned would be tied to a wooden frame of some kind, usually in public, and then it's pretty much exactly what you'd imagine. They'd be cut over and over again until they eventually died. Sometimes the process would be drawn out, sometimes it would be a bit quicker. There aren't a lot of detailed historical records on the exact ways in which this would be practiced, so it would have varied quite a bit, depending on the crime and who was in charge. Not only would this have been a horrific way to go, it was also seen as incredibly humiliating, and on top of that, it was believed that those who died this way would suffer in the afterlife as well, with their bodies not being whole after death.
You think that's bad? Listen to this, because next on our list we have something called the BLOOD eagle, a ritualistic form of execution performed by ancient Vikings throughout the 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th century. Rough time to be a Viking enemy. I'm warning you now, it's about to get graphic. The BLOOD eagle consisted of a person sitting upright and then having the skin on their back cut down the middle and peeled to either side, and then having their ribs severed from their spinal cord in the back with some kind of ancient blade that probably wasn't sharp enough to do the job very quickly, meaning the process most likely took hours. Once severed from the spine, the ribs would then be broken to be positioned outwards like wings coming out of the back of the body. The back skin on either side was then attached to hooks, the hooks to ropes, and the ropes to two large wooden poles on either side of the person so that the Vikings could properly and gruesomely display their sick, eagle-inspired abomination.
The Celts were often described as barbarians by the Romans. They were said to often rush into battle totally nude, they practiced strange rituals, and they had a real love of heads. Now, history is often written by the victor, so the Celts being these wild barbaric tribes may have been overstated, but there was some truth to what was written about them. Like the head thing, for example. Collecting heads as trophies is something a number of ancient civilizations practiced throughout time, but the Celts took things to a different level. They believed the soul was housed in the noggin, and liked using the human heads they lopped off in battle as decorative pieces. They'd hang them off their horses, they'd nail them to the walls, and decorate the fronts of their homes with them. Kind of like demented versions of Halloween decorations, only they weren't trying to be spooky. It was kind of like them putting their medals and trophies in their front lawns.
Next up we have the Mayans. Just as a whole, those guys were super twisted. Honestly, it's hard to even know where to start. As a society, the Mayans were super big on torment and sacrifice, often removing the heads or hearts of their enemies in drawn out ways that many times began with beatings, burnings, and scalpings in order to appease the gods. These sacrifices were often made when new buildings or leaders rose within the civilization, and they were great architects, so that happened a lot. Another pretty gruesome thing they did is they played their own version of soccer mixed with basketball, except it wasn't that much like soccer or basketball because the team that lost had their heads cut off and used as the ball in the next round. Speaking of heads, they liked theirs flat and long, so they often used wooden boards strapped to the heads of young men and women to elongate their heads, and they also filed their teeth into points. I am sure there's more, but let's leave it there for now.
Gladiators were held in pretty high regard in ancient Rome. Sure, many of them were slaves and criminals, but not all. They were all seen as strong, virile warriors though, and that meant there had to be some special power running through their veins. So when a gladiator died, it wasn't uncommon for parts of their bodies to be used to cure different ailments. Epilepsy was a big one. It was believed that consuming the red stuff from a fallen gladiator would give the epileptic person some of the strength the gladiator had in life. Gladiators' livers were also believed to be a powerful medicine, and even when it came to cosmetics, parts of gladiators were used. Their dead skin would be scraped up from bathtubs and used in face creams, which for some reason grosses me out the most. Imagine finding out that UFC fighters' dead skin was used in your bottle of facial moisturizer.
Next up, while not as gruesome as the rest, I have a feeling talking about bed bugs is gonna make it pretty hard to sleep tonight. I get it if you're mad at me, but just remember, I'm doing it to myself too. Bed bugs were rampant in ancient times, and there really wasn't any way to get rid of them, meaning that ancient civilizations just had to deal with the infestations, the bites, and the itching, which of course often led to infection. The oldest bedbug specimen found in Egypt was 3,500 years old, and it was discovered in 1999. But recently, at the Mile Point Cave site in Oregon, researchers discovered an even older member of the bedbug genus that lived over 11,000 years ago and would have likely fed on hunter-gatherer civilizations who seasonally frequented the caves. Yeah, count me out of this whole thing.
How did a samurai test the quality of his katana back in the day? Traditionally, they would duel other samurai in what was known as sujigiri. Sometimes they'd practice with their new blade on criminals and corpses as well. But there was one other way to test the quality of a new katana or fighting style. Just attack a random passerby in the street. In the Sengoku period, the word sujigiri took on a whole new meaning, referring to samurai often testing their blades on innocent people out in the street. They would need to know their blade could cut through a person effectively before taking it into battle. So if there weren't any other options, what better way to test a sword than by doing just that? Usually the victims would be commoners wandering the roads alone at night. Sujigiri started becoming a real problem in the Sengoku period. The samurai just had too much power and seemed to kill indiscriminately. By 1602 though, the practice was outlawed, with offenders being sentenced to death. But that didn't mean it just stopped immediately. In the early years of the Edo period, innocent people were still being sliced up in the street.
Here's something gross about the ancient Egyptians. Not only did ancient Egyptian men love the company of beautiful women, some of them really didn't care whether or not the woman was alive or dead. And so, as was typical in ancient Egypt, when a man died, he was embalmed right away, but when a beautiful woman died, she was actually left to decay for 3 or 4 days in order to make her less desirable to embalmers tasked with working on the preservation of her body. While this might seem a bit extra, it was actually super necessary, because it's not just something ancient Egyptians woke up one day and decided on. It was their solution to a very real problem that became apparent to the rulers of the civilizations after one too many embalmers had gotten caught in the act.
Speaking of ancient Egyptians, there was another practice that was pretty disturbing by today's standards. It wasn't uncommon for servants to be buried alongside their deceased masters, especially those of high rank, like pharaohs. This practice was seen as an honor, not a punishment. Egyptians believed strongly in an afterlife where they would continue their existence, and it was important to make sure there was a smooth transition. Being buried with their master meant the servant could continue serving them in the afterlife. Yeah, imagine you had to go into work one day and you found out your boss had just died. Then you're told you have to join them in their burial just because you work for them. Might sound strange to us today, at least I hope it does. Where are you working if that doesn't sound strange? But back then, it was seen as a sign of respect and devotion.
And finally, let's talk hygiene. While when you think of ancient civilizations, your mind generally does not jump to self-care and cleanliness, rituals of cleaning and freshening up did exist back then, although they may as well not have. For this last point, I'm going to be specifically talking about ancient Roman hygiene, which, for starters, consisted of toothpaste fashioned out of powdered rat brains and using one's own urine as mouthwash. I love history movies, especially ones like Alexander the Great, but it's times like this that I'm super glad they haven't created some kind of 4D viewing experience that allows you to follow the movies with all 5 senses, especially smell. Oh, and remember a few years ago when toilet paper went flying off the shelves and people who didn't get to it in time started seriously freaking out? Well, the Romans wouldn't have minded, because their toilet paper was actually just a sponge tied to a stick that they shared. Oh, and due to methane buildup caused by a lack of irrigation in ancient times, their toilets often exploded. Oh, and their band-aids were made of cobwebs. But that's all the time we have for you today.
One of the most fascinating things in archaeology has to be the disappearance of mass amounts of people, leaving behind their artwork, artifacts, and architecture, and questions about who they were and why they left their homes and cities behind. Seeing as we don't have the technology to fly around the world in 10 minutes yet, we're going to share these incredible places with you through the power of the World Wide Web. And we're starting off the list with a pretty amazing civilization, the Indus. They existed from around 3300 BCE to 1300 BCE in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. It's often called one of the world's oldest civilizations, but they were pretty advanced. They had sanitation systems that wouldn't be matched until the Roman times, which is pretty crazy. They had busy cities with well-planned streets, houses, and even indoor bathrooms, apparently. Two major cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, are probably the most well-known. These cities had intricate brickwork, drainage systems, and there's evidence of a written script that we haven't even been able to fully decipher to this day. These folks were not just good at city building, they were also savvy traders. The Indus people traded with Mesopotamia, using boats to transport goods. Agriculture was a big deal too, with well-irrigated fields for growing crops, but around 1300 BCE, the civilization started to fall off. We're not entirely sure why. Some think it could be due to climate change affecting their water sources, so people up and left migrating southeast. Today, all that's left of the ancient city of Angkor in Cambodia is Angkor Wat, this beautiful temple complex, which also happens to be the largest religious structure in the entire world. Yeah, it's pretty remarkable, and as large as it is, it's still only just one part of a city that used to be larger than modern-day New York City. Angkor, the capital of the Khmer Empire. This place had magnificent temples, including Angkor Wat, so you can only imagine how many more amazing structures there were, considering how vast this place was. But around the 15th century, the city declined and was eventually abandoned. There may have been environmental stress here. The complex irrigation system may have strained resources, causing soil depletion and impacting food production. There could have also been prolonged droughts that affected their ability to support a large population. Researchers aren't exactly sure how many people lived there, of course, but considering the size, there were probably a lot. And there were also power struggles and invasions, which weakened the Khmer Empire, eventually leading to the decline of their largest city, followed by the empire itself about 300 years later. This next civilization was also pretty incredible, but things didn't end quite as smoothly for them as the first point on this list. Rather than people just moving and settling somewhere else because of issues with agriculture, it looks like things ended pretty violently for the Anasazi. The Anasazi were an ancient Native American people who lived in the Four Corners region of the United States, where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. They were skilled builders, creating these impressive homes that were carved into the sides of cliffs. These dwellings were kind of like the skyscrapers of their time. They towered over everything else in the region until the 1880s, when actual skyscrapers came into play. But for as advanced as they were, things did not end well. The theory is that they were dealing with a long-term drought, and deforestation was happening too. They were using up a lot of wood, probably for building and cooking. Add water management issues to the mix, and it's easy to see why things started to fall apart. Tensions rose due to desperation, and that's what likely led to violent conflicts. And by around 1300 AD, the Anasazi had mostly dispersed. Next on the list, we have the Rapa Nui civilization on Easter Island. This is the island with all those amazing stone statues known as moai. The fact that they were able to carve these things out of volcanoes and then transport the 14-ton behemoths around the island is a pretty incredible feat. For a long time, it was a complete mystery as to how they actually did it, but it turns out they would have used a system of ropes with a team pulling the statues back and forth, making the moai kind of like walk. It's pretty cool. So what went wrong with the Rapa Nui? Well, scientists dug into the dirt, looking at ancient charcoal pieces and pollen in the soil, found that the Rapa Nui had chopped down almost every tree on the island. Then rats on the island were eating the tree seeds before new trees could grow, so the forest was completely wiped out. Without trees, the people lost their ability to make rope and canoes, and apparently they started burning grass to make fire. This was all pretty bad, and you can bet tensions were high, and things would have gotten even worse when Europeans showed up in 1722. The first Europeans to set foot on Easter Island, they did their thing. They didn't come in peace. It's about as classic as it gets, unfortunately. And if that wasn't enough, by the 1870s, waves of smallpox and a major Peruvian slave raid hit the Rapa Nui, and these were the last nails in the coffin for the already small population on the island. Next up are the Mississippians. The Mississippians were a group of Native American societies that thrived in the southeastern United States from around 800 to 1600 AD. They were known for building these complex societies with impressive mounds, and Cahokia was one of their biggest and most impressive cities. This place, located near present-day St. Louis, Missouri, was the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico. At its peak, it had a population of around 20,000 people, possibly even double that. It had enormous earthen mounds, including the famous Monk's Mound, which is still one of the largest man-made earthen mounds in North America, but it eventually fell. Around the late 13th century, the population began to dwindle, and by the 14th century, the city was largely abandoned. Nature slowly reclaimed the area. It's not very clear what led to the decline. There aren't explicit records from that time, but it was probably a combination of things, environmental and economic. Next on the list are the people of the Nabta Playa. So Nabta Playa is a dry lake bed located in the Nubian desert of southern Egypt. It has these archaeological remains dating back to around 10,000 to 6,000 years ago during the Neolithic period. The people who once lived here left behind evidence of their advanced understanding of astronomy and agriculture. They erected a stone circle kind of similar to the Stonehenge in England, which seems to be what they used to map the stars. Some archaeologists think these stone formations worked as an ancient kind of calendar, but other than the stone circles they left behind, we really don't know a whole lot about the people of Nabta Playa. Archaeologists and historians are still trying to piece together their daily lives, social structures, and what ultimately happened to them. The site seems to have been abandoned around 5,000 years ago, but the lack of written records from that time period makes it tough to pinpoint the exact reasons behind their disappearance. Next up, we have Çatalhöyük. Çatalhöyük in central Turkey is not only one of the first known urban settlements in the world, but also one of the strangest. So instead of streets like you have with most cities, every city, here all the homes and buildings were connected, and to get around, people walked along the paths on roofs and then descended down into their homes with ladders. Looking at images of the place, it looks almost like a big ginormous honeycomb type of formation. It's very unique. There aren't really any places like it. There were also no cemeteries. Residents buried their dead underneath their own homes. The fate of its inhabitants is still mysterious, which isn't surprising considering how ancient it is. But around 6700 BCE, the site was abandoned, and researchers are still piecing together the reasons behind it. The ancient city of Thonis, which now sits at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. I love ancient underwater cities. There's just something so beautiful but eerie about them at the same time. So Thonis was an Egyptian city located near the mouth of the Nile River. It was one of the most important port cities in ancient Egypt, a thriving port city during the time of the pharaohs, a center for trade with Greece and other Mediterranean countries, and it played a big role in the Egyptian economy. The city had these grand temples and statues dedicated to the various gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt, but then it sank. There were probably natural disasters like earthquakes, and of course the sea levels rose, and for centuries this place was lost and forgotten until underwater archaeologists discovered its ruins in 2000, with divers finding well-preserved artifacts like statues, pottery, and religious objects. Alright, we gotta talk about it. the lost city of Atlantis. Atlantis was a legendary city, first mentioned by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. And according to Plato, Atlantis was this powerful and advanced civilization that existed around 9,000 years before his own time. So that's about 11,000 years ago from today. But it's still a complete mystery as to whether or not this place really did exist. A lot of uppity scientists say it didn't, but they also sound very not fun. It's said that Atlantis had a sophisticated government, advanced technology, and a prosperous economy. The Atlanteans were described as this powerful, warlike people who eventually became corrupt and decadent, leading the gods to punish them by submerging their island beneath the sea in a single day and night. The exact location of Atlantis is still unknown, and there are a lot of archaeologists that figure Atlantis, the whole story behind it, was really just a legend and an allegory rather than an actual place. Some of the rumored locations, though, range from the Mediterranean to Antarctica, but there's never been any definitive physical evidence of its existence. And finally, of course, we have the Maya, who created some of the most incredible architecture and artwork of any known ancient civilization. And not only were their cities and artwork spectacular, but their knowledge about astronomy was unparalleled for the time. But around the 9th and 10th centuries, their cities, which once bustled with life, started to empty out, and that's always been a mystery as to why. It's hard to pinpoint an exact cause because parts of the civilization fell at various times. It was a wide-stretching civilization with various languages and practices across the board, but there are some ideas as to what happened. Environmental stress is usually a big factor. Could have been droughts or crop failures. Another thing could be overpopulation. Resources could have started running thin, and when there's overpopulation, there's more violence. Not a great recipe for a peaceful society. There might have been some political problems as well, with rulers losing control, causing internal conflicts.
Starting off our list today with the peoples of Nan Madol, who lived approximately 1,200 years ago in the ancient city Nan Madol off Pohnpei, Micronesia, located in the Western Pacific, about 2,500 miles southwest of Hawaii. The civilization lived on the east side of the island, but the materials used to build their civilization were only ever available on the west side. And so the people of Nan Madol must have journeyed from one side of the island to the other in order to retrieve the 750,000 tons of heavy basalt they used to construct their intricate structures. By the way, the average modern-day cruise ship only weighs about 250,000 tons, so these materials would have been about triple that. And not only did they have to move these materials, they had to carve and shape and stack them too. I mean, clearly they did a great job, seeing as many of their structures still stand today, but it was also done without any concrete or mortar whatsoever. It's literally just the weight of the stones that have held ritual sites, temples, and tombs together to this day. It is an amazing achievement, but historians truly have no idea how the civilization could have possibly done what they did without the assistance of modern-day technology. It's a true historic mystery.
When it comes to mysterious ancient Mesoamerican civilizations, the Mayans are usually the first to come to mind, but probably even more mysterious are the Olmecs. You look up Olmecs on Google Images and you'll see tons of pictures of their beautifully crafted sculptures, but not a whole lot is really known about their culture or why they disappeared. They were one of the earliest civilizations in the Americas, living in what is now southern Mexico, around 1200 to 400 BCE. From what has been left behind, they were a pretty advanced civilization, but even still, so much about them has been lost to time. They're probably most well known for their colossal stone heads, massive sculptures, some weighing as much as 40 tons, often depicting human faces. The fact that the Olmecs transported and carved them without the type of technology we had today is pretty impressive. They may have also developed one of the earliest known writing systems in the Americas, but only a few inscriptions have ever been found, and they're hard to decipher. They seem to influence later cultures though. Their art style, some of their religious symbols, they appear in other Mesoamerican societies that came along after the Olmecs had vanished. So maybe they just dispersed and formed into other societies.
Next up, we have the peoples of Göbekli Tepe, an 11,000-year-old ancient civilization in southeastern Turkey found in 1994 that is believed to have built the world's very first temple, and archaeologists and historians have absolutely no idea how they could have done it. Only 5% of the site has been excavated to date, but so far the ruins of 20 circles of rock pillars, which with each pillar weighing up to 50 tons and most measuring in at almost 16 feet high, engraved with animal carvings and human forms, were located at the site of Göbekli Tepe, with no clues as to how the massive formations could have possibly been erected in the prehistoric world. The structures created at Göbekli Tepe are comparable with the achievements of the Great Pyramids, which came roughly 7,000 years after the first temple was built. While scientists studying the site have absolutely no idea how it came to be, they have theorized that it was used for either ancient rituals or as an ancient observatory. Basically, they have no idea what's going on here. They're stumped and they're confused. What was it? Baffled, bobbled, discum, bobbled. They don't understand.
I love the idea of lost ancient civilizations, ones that may or may not have actually existed. Makes you wonder if there's this lost period of time similar to what Robert E. Howard depicted in his Conan stories. One supposedly lost civilization you don't hear about often, though, is the lost continent of Mu. So according to the story, Mu was a large landmass somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, home to an advanced civilization. The continent is said to have sank beneath the waves thousands of years ago. So, a lot like Atlantis. Mu is often said to be pretty much the same as Lemuria as well. The idea of Mu became popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries thanks to writers like James Churchward. Churchward claimed to have discovered these ancient tablets in India that told the story of Mu. He described it as a highly developed society with sophisticated knowledge of science and technology, but there's said to be no verifiable evidence of Mu or Lemuria. The idea that an entire continent would just sink like that in such a short amount of time is just not really how it works. The land may break apart and drift over time, but it wouldn't just vanish without a trace. Still though, there could be a grain of truth behind the legend and others like it. Stories of Mu might be based on real events that have just been misinterpreted over time or embellished. Could be referring to smaller islands that were submerged, for example.
Next up, we have the Kofun tombs, 16,000 ancient tombs, the largest of which is over 1,000 feet wide and 1,600 feet long, which is twice as long as the largest tomb in the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Kofun tombs are located in Japan. They are tightly sealed, and for some reason, they also look like a giant keyhole. Historians assume that the Kofun tombs were built for the 16th emperor of Japan, Emperor Nintoku, who supposedly died in 399 AD at the age of 109. But since they have yet to excavate the sacred site, there is really no way to know for sure. Right now, it's really just one big mystery, and it's looking like it might stay that way, unfortunately, or fortunately, because the grounds are classified as a sacred religious area. Trying to enter them is illegal, and trying to dig them up would surely land you at least 1 or 2 years behind bars. I think we should maybe just let this one rest and remain a mystery. Sometimes it's nice to wonder.
Next, we head to China with the Sanxingdui, an ancient culture and archaeological site found in 1986. It's one of the most mysterious archaeological finds in China. Now, there were clues about an ancient society in the area discovered all the way back in 1927, but a much larger scale excavation was carried out in 1986 after workers digging a ditch stumbled on these 2 large pits filled with thousands of artifacts, which turned out to be over 3,000 years old. The Sanxingdui culture produced incredible art and craftsmanship unlike anything seen from other ancient Chinese cultures. Included in the artifacts were bronze masks, gold and jade items, and intricate statues. One of the biggest mysteries of Sanxingdui is why the civilization suddenly vanished. The artifacts seem to hint that they were a highly developed society, but there aren't any written records or any clear explanations for why they would have disappeared. It also seems like they were different from other ancient Chinese cultures. Their art and their artifacts are so unique that they don't seem to fit with the known history and development of ancient China. So when it comes to who these people were and what their culture was like, we really can't say for sure.
Next up, we have the Boskop man, a potential prehistoric, now extinct, human-like species that could have lived as recently as 10,000 years ago and might have had craniums much larger than our own. It is estimated that their brains could have been up to 30% larger than our own, and if that was the case, their IQ would have been around 149. The average IQ in America is 98. However, the increased intelligence would, of course, depend on where the Boskop man carried the majority of their brain mass, as intelligence increase generally happens in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is largely responsible for our highest cognitive functions like decision-making, memory, and self-awareness. With that being said, perhaps their frontal cortices were so big that they became so self-aware they ended up enlightened and eventually decided to become one with the universe. This, of course, is all scientific speculation, seeing as the only evidence of the peoples are partial skull fragments, but many scientists seem to believe the theory, so personally, I'm on board with the highly intelligent prehistoric men that probably would have beat me in a game of chess, but I think anyone would. I suck at chess.
Next on the list, we have the city of Cahokia, which is located in what is now Collinsville, Illinois. At one time, it was a thriving city built by the Mississippian culture. Today, visitors can't explore the city, or what's left of it anyway. There's not much. It is pretty cool though. It just looks like a series of oddly shaped hills, but these hills weren't naturally formed. They're man-made dirt mounds that were once home to thousands of people. Cahokia started as a collection of small villages around 1050 AD, but by 1250, it was one of the largest settlements in the Americas. But then, it was mysteriously abandoned or destroyed. We still don't know exactly what happened. There are no written records from that time, and there wasn't a whole lot of archaeological evidence left behind.
Next up, we have my favorite. I don't care if you don't care about it. It's Atlantis, the peoples of Atlantis. And before you run to the comments to tell me you don't believe it or you've heard it before, sit back, relax, and listen to some evidence you might have not heard before. Did you know that there are actually records of Atlantis written by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, who described the city being located just outside the Strait of Gibraltar? For centuries, people thought that Plato was off his rocker. Many people still do. But what many people don't know is that while everyone is out searching for the lost city in the deep ocean, it might have already been found. In space. Well, it was discovered from space, and it's located in Mauritania, Africa. In 1965, the Richat structure, a deeply eroded dominal structure, was discovered by two astronauts while flying over Africa. While the area is barren and dry today, evidence suggests that at one time, the entire structure was submerged completely underwater. Sound familiar? Could this truly be the lost city of Atlantis, or is it still just out there waiting to be found? Or if you think it doesn't exist, you're wrong.
And finally, we have what are known as the Big Circles, mysterious structures found in a number of locations across the Middle East. The massive circular shapes are only visible from above, and they're made of stone walls or small stone mounds. They've been spotted in different locations in the region, mainly in Jordan and Syria. But what were they built for? Nobody really knows. One of the strangest aspects of the Big Circles is their age, which is hard to even figure out without any artifacts connected with them or any written records. Archaeologists have found it tough to date these structures accurately, leading to a lot of debates about their origins and even the cultures that might have created them. Lots of theories have come about in the attempt to unravel the purpose of the circles. Some researchers have said that the circles served as burial sites. Others speculate that they may have been used to house animals, but the walls aren't really high enough for that, most of them only having been built a few feet high. Of course, we have a bit of a similarity here to crop circles, and hey, we all know the conspiracies surrounding them, so I find this one kind of cool. Were there really giants roaming the earth in ancient times? Well, with cases of massive 8, 10, 12, even 18-foot bones being unearthed?
It certainly seems like there's more to our history than we're often taught. Let's check it out.
So pictured here is a man named Les Eaton lying next to a skeleton in a doctor's office. Keep in mind, Les Eaton was 6 feet tall, and this thing just dwarfs him. The skeleton was discovered in 1933 near Stiuso, Missouri. A young boy had been searching for arrowheads when he stumbled on something a little more interesting, a skeleton measuring over 8 feet in length. The skeleton was in pretty good condition, too. A local doctor named Dr. Parker had it displayed in his office for a while, allowing people to come and gawk at the sheer size of the remains or lie next to it and have someone take a photo of them. Eventually, it was sent to the Smithsonian Institution for further study, but that's really all the information there is about this guy. After it was shipped off, it was never heard about again. There's been little to no follow-up information available, so it's definitely understandable why some people think there could be something sus going on here.
8 foot plus would be considered giant today, so imagine all the necks that would have broken looking up at this guy sometime between 1000 and 200 BC, when the average height of a female was merely 5'1" and the average height of a male was 5'8", which, to be fair, isn't that far from the average height of men and women today, with women coming in at 5.4 and men 5.9. Still, the discovery of an 8 foot 1.5 inch skeleton was a massive find when it was excavated near a massive burial mound in Ohio back in 2012. At the time, the skeleton belonged to the tallest man ever recorded in human history. Of course, today that record has been broken by 9.5 inches, but still. Along with the incredibly tall skeleton, lead researcher on the project, Hugh, found many other bones of unusual size, including what he described as a giant jawbone. Oh, and all of the bones found at the site were authenticated by the Smithsonian Institution. So you can rest easy tonight knowing that this giant prehistoric man was 100% undeniably real. Or you can toss and turn through nightmares of him chasing you through a dark forest. It's your choice.
Back in 1870, a story came out in the paper about the discovery of an 18-foot skeleton. Not the skeleton of some gigantic animal either. No, this was said to be a human skeleton, or something resembling a human. Really hard to say if an 18-foot tall giant can be classified as simply a human. Now, could this one have been an incredible exaggeration or a hoax? Of course, but it is really fascinating that this was a story that had been published in a newspaper. The story came out in the Oil City Times in 1870. It read, "On Tuesday morning last, while Mr. William Thompson, assisted by Mr. Robert R. Smith, was engaged in making an excavation near the house of the former, about half a mile north of West Hickory, they exhumed an enormous helmet of iron, which was corroded with rust. Further digging brought to light a sword, which measured 9 feet in length. After some little time, they discovered the bones of 2 enormous feet. Following up on the leads they had unexpectedly struck, in a few hours' time they had unearthed the well-preserved remains of an enormous giant belonging to a species of the human family, which probably inhabited this and other parts of the world, at the time of which the Bible speaks when it says, 'And there were giants in those days.' The bones of the skeleton are a remarkable white. The teeth are all in their places and all of extraordinary size. When he was in the flesh, he must have stood 18 feet tall in his stockings. These remarkable relics will be shipped to New York early next week. These remains were found about 12 feet under the surface of a mound which had been thrown up probably centuries ago."
Sometimes the government hides things from the public in order to keep us safe, and sometimes the government hides things from us because they want to keep us dumb, which is probably the case when it comes to the 12-foot skeleton that was dug up and was promptly reburied in 1819 in Lompoc Rancho, California. Now, to be fair, when the giant skeleton was dug up by soldiers living on the ranch who hacked their way through a thick layer of cemented gravel to reach the sarcophagus holding the skeleton, the natives of the land deemed it a god and asked that it be reburied. But you're telling me that since then no one has used any kind of scanning technology or taken any soil samples from the burial site in an effort to authenticate and study the giant bones? I gotta call BS on this one. My guess, the skeleton isn't there anymore because it was taken a long time ago to be studied by people who don't want us to know it exists. maybe it's an alien.
The Bulgarian Giant. Back in 2015, downtown in the ancient city of Varna, archaeologists found the remains of an exceptionally tall man for the time he was alive. While excavating a Copper Age necropolis near Varna, researchers uncovered the remains of a skeleton dating back approximately 6,500 years. It was found partially buried beneath an ancient fortress wall, positioned east-west, with its hands placed on the waist, which was how a lot of burial practices happened at the time. The skeleton was much taller than the average person of that era, close to 7 feet in height. The skeleton was found in a carefully dug grave, meaning the big tall man likely held a high position in their society. Some things just never change.
In 1895, the Smithsonian purchased an 8-foot, 4-inch tall mummy for $500. In 1908, they called it a hoax, but experts aren't so sure. The first report of the giant appeared in 1895. It claimed the mummy was 9 feet tall when in reality it was just 2 inches less than 8.5. Still, the Smithsonian made the decision to purchase the artifact for $500 that same year after examining it and declaring it to be a legitimate find. Now, all of a sudden, 13 years later in 1908, they called it a hoax and claimed that it was made of gelatin. I really don't know how a bunch of America's best scientists could have possibly missed that for an entire 13 years. Not to mention it wasn't cheap. $500 back then is equal to well over 14 grand today, and the Smithsonian didn't have the same funding in the 1890s that it does now. I'm just saying something's not adding up, and what's even stranger is that something quite similar happened in Oklahoma around the same time. A mummified giant measuring in at 8 feet 5 inches was put on display, only to disappear shortly after word began to spread. It sounds a bit like a cover-up if you ask me, which you kinda did. I mean, you clicked on the video.
Even the New York Times came out with an article about a giant. Back in February of 1902, an article came out with the title reading New Mexico Discovery, 12-foot giant found. According to the article, a discovery was made near an ancient burial ground. Luciana Quintana, a landowner, had found 2 stones with mysterious inscriptions, and beneath were bones from a frame that was estimated to be at least 12 feet long. Excavators said they found a 4-foot-long forearm and a well-preserved jaw, with lower teeth ranging from the size of a hickory nut to that of a large walnut. That was how they just described sizes back then, I guess, just used nuts. The giant's chest reportedly had a circumference of 7 feet. I wonder how many nuts that is. At the time, they speculated that thousands of other giant skeletons were waiting to be found. Legends had been told by early Spanish invaders about giant humanoids roaming the plains, and Native American carvings also seemed to depict some race of massive human.
Directly after a groundbreaking discovery made in 1959, lead researcher Donald Dregu was quoted saying, "The individual was of large proportions. When measured in the tomb, his length was approximately 7 feet 2 inches, and all of the long boxes were very heavy." The skeleton in question was found in Cresap Mound in West Virginia inside of a burial mound containing at least 5 other skeletons, a clay bench, and a fire basin, which might explain why the top half of the 7-foot 2-inch skeleton was burned. Well, it explains how, not really why. And it also doesn't explain why the bones of the skeleton were unusually heavy either. At the time the discovery was made, it was massive, but nothing really came of it, leading myself and many others to wonder why. What are they hiding?
Scattered across Sardinia are the famous giants' tombs, built during the island's Nuragic period. These structures, often reaching up to 100 feet in length, have been the cause of a lot of local legends. Mainly that these tombs were built to house some very large people, maybe even giants. But the mainstream archaeology world explains them as communal burial sites. The tombs are long chambers constructed from massive slabs placed vertically and horizontally to form a corridor-like structure. The chamber is then covered with smaller rocks and earth, creating a mound. A distinctive feature of these tombs is their entrances, which had a semicircular row of standing stones. They look pretty cool. Definitely something I'd want to check out one day.
A giant mound shaped like a giant snake containing giant skeletons. Fitting, right? Serpent Mound in Ohio is the world's largest surviving effigy mound, which is super cool in and of itself, but it got a whole lot cooler when, in the 1890s, Professor Frederick Ward Puntham decided to excavate some of the mound's bones located next to the effigy. What did he find? Well, seeing as this is a video about ancient giants, it would be pretty weird if I said unicorns. In reality, the professor found multiple 6-foot-tall skeletons and possibly one that was 7 feet. In a postcard sent by the professor, the giant skeleton can be seen laid out on a large stone, and underneath the skeleton it says, "Skeleton of mound builder, 7 feet in length, serpent mound." The only thing is, the skeleton is cut off at the shins, and the professor never confirmed if the measurement was an estimate of what the height of the entire skeleton might have been, or what the found bones measured up to, meaning that the skeleton could have possibly measured in at much taller than 7 feet, or perhaps slightly shorter. Again, the discovery didn't really go anywhere. It kind of just fell off the face of the earth, leading us to wonder why.